This lesson, we're going to use what we learned last time on partitioning data with Kafka to actually sample data from Kafka. Sampling is really useful if you have a very high volume of data that you're pushing through a particular topic. This could be log files that you're sending through, or it could be user click activity. If you want to partition it out and only look at a sample of what's going on, it makes it so it's easier to just have a peek at what's happening. So let's write a producer that will enable us to actually sample data from Kafka. Kafka opts for throughput instead of features on the broker. What that means is that when it comes to partitioning data and sampling, it relies on an agreement between the producer and the consumer. So let's write the producer that will allow us to sample data. All right, I've already started things off. So we can see we have the familiar things. We have Ruby gems, Kafka, and we're going to use JSON. We're going to pick up the number of partitions that we want to send to off the command line. We initialize the producer, and we just put some output so that we know where we're putting things to. Okay. So before, we had just randomly selected which partition to send to. In this case, we're going to use a hash to deterministically figure out where we're going to send the data. That is, which partition we want to send each message to. So let's take the example of user activity. So let's start with some fake user IDs. We'll say they're actually integers. And let's just send some fake data through. First, we want to select a user ID that we're going to fake. What this line of code will do is it will select a user based on the iteration that we're on. So the first time we run through, we'll pick up the first user, and then we'll pick up the second user and the third as we iterate through. So let's create a message to send to the producer. And we're just going to send it JSON. So we'll say user ID, this user ID, and we'll just send some data. And convert that to JSON. Now, before we send this message, we have to tell the producer which partition we want to send it to. So to do that, we'll figure out which users go to which partitions. So in this example, we're setting the partition to the user ID mod the partition count. So if we were to have 10 partitions, this user would get sent to partition 2. This user would get sent to partition 7, and this user would get sent to partition 2. You can see it's the last digit that matters if it's 10 partitions. So let's send the message. And now we'll add a little bit of output so we know which users are going to which partitions. Let's run the producer and see what it outputs. We'll specify 2 partitions. Okay, so we see that this user went to partition 0, this one to partition 1, so that's as we expect. Now that we've written the producer, let's write a consumer to pick up those messages. Now using partitioning like this, that is, sending all users to a specific partition, is called semantic partitioning. It's useful if you want to do things like this, or you could also aggregate server logs to specific partitions. So you could have each server mapped to a single partition. That way, if you wanted to pull logs or tail those logs, you could do that on a per partition and per server basis. Let's edit the consumer. All right. I started us off with the basic setup. We have Ruby gems, Kafka, and JSON. We have to specify at the command line which user we want to sample from and how many partitions there are in the system. We parse out the user ID and the partition count, and we set the partition that we're going to be reading from. When we initialize the consumer, we specify the partition here. And we have some friendly output to show that we're reading from the right place. So let's have the consumer loop through the messages that it receives. We'll parse the message payload, which was JSON that we had sent through on the producer side. And let's just output that. All right, let's run the consumer and see what happens. Specify a user ID that we want to work with. How about this user? And we're running 2 partitions. All right, with the consumer started, let's run the producer again and see what comes to it. Okay, we are interested in sampling for this specific user, but we can see that there are 2 users coming through. And that's because they're both living on the same partition. When you have something that you're sampling, like number of users in your system, you can't possibly have as many partitions as you have users. So this is definitely going to happen. This just lets you pare down the amount of data to something more manageable so that you can then have the consumer throw out the extraneous data that it doesn't need. Let's update our consumer so that it can do that. Okay, we'll want to do that here. So, if the user ID is equal to the user ID that we're looking for, we'll just output their info. Otherwise, we'll just say that we're skipping it. And fix this typo, and we should be good to go. Let's run the consumer again and see what we get. And we have another typo to fix really quick. And we'll run the consumer and see what we get. Okay, so it's running on the BigData sample, partition 02, and looking for that specific user. Let's run the producer again. And we can see that it's outputting for the user that we want and skipping the user that we don't. If we're not doing anything except for outputting stuff to the command line, this kind of sampling doesn't really help us much. However, if we're feeding the data into a machine learning algorithm that's updating a model, it can be useful, and it's something we'll look at later on in these lessons. So in this lesson, you've learned about semantic partitioning in Kafka and how you can use that to separate users out into different partitions or server logs into separate partitions. We've also learned about sampling from messages in a topic in the consumer.